Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to discover they were living a double life right under your nose? For 27 years, I thought I had the perfect marriage, a loving husband, a beautiful family, and a life we built together from the ground up. But all of that came crashing down on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my daughter's life. Imagine this. Your husband stands up at your child's wedding, raises his glass, and instead of toasting to love and family, he announces he's leaving you for his secretary. Oh, and he's taking your life savings with him. Sounds like something out of a bad movie, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. But what my husband didn't know was that I wasn't the naive, helpless woman he thought I was. I had a plan of my own. And by the end of the night, it wasn't me who was left humiliated. It was him. Let me tell you how I turned the tables. I never imagined my daughter's wedding day would turn into the most humiliating moment of my life. The ceremony was perfect. Blue skies, a gentle breeze, and the sound of laughter filling the air. Emily, my 24-year-old daughter, looked radiant in her white gown, her smile lighting up the room as she walked down the aisle with her soon-to-be husband, Daniel. It was a day we had all been looking forward to for months, a celebration of love and family. But little did I know, it would also be the day my husband, Richard, would destroy everything we had built over 27 years of marriage. I'm Sophia, a 48-year-old high school teacher from Seattle. I've always been proud of the life Richard and I built together. He's a successful lawyer, well-respected in his field, and we've always been seen as the perfect couple by our friends and family. We raised Emily in a loving home, and while we weren't wealthy, we were comfortable. I thought we were happy. I thought I knew him. But over the past few months, I started noticing cracks in the facade. Richard had been acting distant, spending more time at the office and less time at home. He claimed he was working on a big case, but something about his behavior felt off. He was constantly on his phone, stepping out of the room to take calls and avoiding eye contact when I asked him about his day. I chalked it up to stress. After all, being a lawyer isn't easy, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside. Today was supposed to be about Emily and Daniel, not about my suspicions. The ceremony went off without a hitch, and the reception was held in a beautiful garden venue just outside the city. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed through the air. I should have been happy. I should have been celebrating. But Richard's behavior was impossible to ignore. He kept glancing at his phone, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around the room, as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. And then there was Clara. She was Richard's secretary, a 32-year-old woman with a sharp smile and a wardrobe that screamed, "Look at me." She had been working for Richard for 3 years, and while I'd always found her a bit too familiar with him, I never thought much of it. After all, Richard was my husband. I trusted him. But seeing her at the wedding, dressed in a tight red dress that seemed more suited for a nightclub than a family event, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Why was she even here? She wasn't family. She wasn't a close friend. Yet there she was, hovering near Richard like a shadow. As the evening went on, my unease grew. Something was about to happen. I could feel it. And when Richard stood up to make a toast, champagne glass in hand, I knew my instincts had been right. This wasn't going to be a normal wedding speech. This was going to be something else entirely. The first red flag appeared about 3 months ago. Richard had always been meticulous about our finances, but lately I started noticing unusual transactions in our joint account. At first it was small things. Dinners at expensive restaurants I'd never heard of, charges from high-end boutiques, and hotel stays that didn't match any of his supposed business trips. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was buying a surprise gift for me or treating a client. But as the weeks went on, the charges became more frequent, and the amounts grew larger. One night, while Richard was working late, I decided to log into our bank account. What I found made my stomach drop. There were multiple transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account I didn't recognize. I scrolled through the transactions, my heart pounding. Jewelry purchases, first-class plane tickets, and even a deposit on a luxury villa in the Bahamas. None of these were things we had discussed, and they certainly weren't for me. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I decided to dig deeper. I've always been a patient person. It's a skill you develop after years of teaching teenagers. I started keeping track of every suspicious transaction, every unexplained expense. I even went through his emails when he left his laptop open one evening. That's when I found the messages between him and Clara. The emails were explicit, filled with plans for their new life together. They talked about the villa in the Bahamas, the money he was transferring to their secret account, and even the timing of their big announcement. My blood boiled as I read their words. Clara referred to me as the old ball and chain, and Richard didn't even bother to defend me. Instead, he reassured her that soon I'd be out of the picture and they'd have everything they needed to start fresh. But the worst part? They had chosen Emily's wedding as the perfect moment to reveal their relationship. Richard believed that the public setting would prevent me from making a scene. He thought I'd be too embarrassed to fight back in front of our family and friends. He thought he had the upper hand. What he didn't know was that I had already started preparing for this moment. I reached out to my lawyer, Martha, a no-nonsense woman who had helped several of my friends through their divorces. Together, we spent weeks gathering evidence. I documented every transaction, every email, every piece of proof I could find. Martha helped me file for divorce and secure a court order to freeze our joint accounts. I even transferred the majority of our savings into a separate account in my name. Legally, of course. Richard thought he was being clever, but he underestimated me. The final piece of the puzzle came from one of Richard's colleagues, a woman named Linda. Linda worked in HR at Richard's law firm, and she had always been friendly with me. One afternoon, she called me, her voice hesitant. "Sophia, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but Clara just submitted a transfer request to Richard's new office in the Bahamas. I thought you should know." That was the confirmation I needed. Richard wasn't just having an affair, he was planning to abandon me entirely. He was going to drain our accounts, leave me with nothing, and start a new life with Clara. But what he didn't realize was that I was already 2 steps ahead. I spent the next few weeks finalizing my plan. I worked with Martha to ensure that every legal detail was covered. I moved our savings, gathered evidence of Richard's financial misconduct, and even reached out to the ethics committee at his law firm. They had been investigating him for months, suspecting that he was using company resources to fund his affair. I made sure they had everything they needed to build their case. By the time Emily's wedding day arrived, I was ready. I knew Richard was going to make his announcement, and I knew Clara would be there, gloating. But I wasn't going to let them ruin this day for Emily. Or for me. I had spent 27 years building a life with Richard, and I wasn't about to let him take it all away without a fight. As I watched him that evening, nervously checking his phone and avoiding my gaze, I felt a strange sense of calm. He thought he was in control, but he had no idea what was coming. I reached into my purse, feeling the weight of the envelope I had prepared. Inside were the divorce papers, the evidence of his affair, and the court order freezing his assets. Everything was ready. All I had to do was wait for the right moment. And when Richard stood up to make his toast, champagne glass in hand, I knew that moment had arrived. Richard stood at the head of the room, champagne glass in hand, his face a mask of confidence. The guests quieted down, their attention turning to him. I could see Emily and Daniel sitting at the center table, their hands intertwined, their faces glowing with happiness. This was supposed to be their moment, a celebration of their love and future together. But Richard was about to turn it into something else entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and commanding, the way it always was when he addressed a courtroom. "Today is a day of joy, a day of new beginnings. We're here to celebrate Emily and Daniel as they embark on this beautiful journey together." The room erupted in applause, and I forced myself to smile, though my stomach churned. I knew what was coming. I could see it in the way Clara stood off to the side, her red dress clinging to her like a second skin, her lips curled into a smug smile. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, as if she couldn't wait for the bombshell to drop. Richard continued, his tone shifting slightly. "But today is also a day of reflection. It's a reminder that life is short, and sometimes we have to make difficult decisions to pursue our own happiness." My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him glance at Clara. He raised his glass higher, his voice growing louder. "And so, I have an announcement to make. Clara and I—" He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the room. "Are in love. We've decided to start a new life together." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Emily's face went pale, her mouth slightly open in shock. Daniel froze, his hand tightening around hers. The guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to react. Some looked at me, their expressions a mix of pity and disbelief. Others stared at Clara, who now stepped forward, her hand resting possessively on Richard's arm. But Richard wasn't done. "I know this may come as a surprise," he said, his voice calm and measured, as if he were delivering a closing argument. "But Clara and I have been planning this for some time. We've already made arrangements to move to the Bahamas, where we'll be starting fresh. In fact," he added with a smirk, "our flight leaves tonight." Clara, unable to contain herself, pulled a first-class ticket from her clutch and waved it in the air. "We've already found the perfect villa on the beach," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Thanks to Richard's careful planning, we'll be living the dream." The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and gasps. I could see Emily trembling, her hands shaking as she clutched Daniel's arm. Her wedding day, the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl, was being hijacked by her own father. My blood boiled as I watched Richard bask in the attention, completely oblivious to the pain he was causing. And then, as if to twist the knife even further, Richard turned to me. "Sophia," he said, his tone almost patronizing, "I've left you enough in our joint account to cover a few months of expenses. I think that's more than fair, considering the circumstances." "Fair?" My jaw tightened as I fought to keep my composure. He thought he was being generous. He thought I would sit there, humiliated and defeated, while he walked away with everything we had built together. He thought I would let him ruin Emily's wedding without a fight. He was wrong. I stood up slowly, the room falling silent once again as all eyes turned to me. I could feel the weight of the envelope in my purse, the culmination of months of preparation. Richard's smirk faltered slightly as he met my gaze. He must have seen something in my expression, something he hadn't expected. Calm. "Richard," I said, my voice steady and clear, "are you finished?" He blinked, clearly caught off guard. Yes, I suppose I am." "Good," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out the envelope, "because now it's my turn." The room was silent as I stood there, holding the envelope in my hand. All eyes were on me now, including Richard's. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Clara, still clinging to his arm, looked confused, her confidence faltering. She clearly hadn't expected me to say anything, let alone stand up to them in front of everyone. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for. I wasn't going to let Richard and Clara walk away unscathed, not after everything they had done, not after the months of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. "Richard," I began, my voice calm but firm. You've always prided yourself on being a man of strategy, haven't you? A man who thinks 3 steps ahead, who always has the upper hand. Well, I hate to break it to you, but this time you underestimated me. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, the divorce papers. I held them up for everyone to see, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. These, I said, my voice carrying across the room, are divorce papers. I filed them weeks ago, the moment I discovered your affair with Clara. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Clara's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes darting between me and the papers. She looked like she wanted to disappear. But that's not all, I continued, pulling out the next set of documents. These are bank statements, showing every single transaction you made to your little offshore account in the Cayman Islands, every dollar you tried to steal from our joint savings, every penny you thought you could hide from me. It's all here. I walked toward him, my heels clicking against the floor, and placed the papers on the table in front of him. Oh, and by the way, I added, my tone sharp, those accounts have been frozen. Legally, you won't be touching a single cent of that money. Richard's face turned a deep shade of red, his hands clenching into fists. You can't do this, he stammered, his voice shaking with anger. That money is mine. Actually, I said, crossing my arms, it's ours, and the court agrees with me. You see, Richard, while you were busy sneaking around with Clara, I was busy working with my lawyer. I've been 2 steps ahead of you this entire time. The guests were whispering now, their shock and disbelief palpable. I could see Emily staring at me, her eyes wide with a mix of emotions. Confusion, anger, and, I hoped, pride. This wasn't how I wanted her wedding day to go, but I wasn't going to let Richard ruin it without standing up for myself. And one more thing, I said, pulling out the final document. This is a letter from the ethics committee at your law firm. They've been investigating you for months, Richard. Turns out, using company resources to fund your affair and your little getaway with Clara is a serious violation of their policies. I made sure they had all the evidence they needed to build their case. Richard's jaw dropped, his face now a mix of rage and panic. You vindictive... Careful, Richard, I interrupted, my voice cold. You're already in enough trouble. I wouldn't make it worse if I were you. Clara, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her voice shrill. You're just bitter because Richard chose me. You can't stand the fact that he's moving on. I turned to her, my expression calm. Clara, let me give you some advice. If you're going to build a life with someone, maybe don't pick a man who's willing to betray his wife and steal from his family, because if he'll do it to me, he'll do it to you. Her face flushed, and she took a step back, her confidence crumbling. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization that Richard wasn't the prize she thought he was. Without the money, without his career, what did he really have to offer her? The room was dead silent as I turned back to Richard. You thought you could humiliate me today, didn't you? You thought you could announce your affair, walk away with our money, and leave me with nothing. But you were wrong. This isn't your victory, Richard. I stepped back, letting my words sink in. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear, his face a mask of anger, humiliation, and defeat. Clara, realizing the gravity of the situation, let go of his arm and took another step back, distancing herself from him. The guests were still whispering, their eyes darting between me, Richard, and Clara. I could see the judgment in their faces, the way they were silently condemning him for what he had done. And then, to my surprise, Emily stood up. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady as she addressed her father. How could you do this? She asked, her voice breaking. How could you ruin my wedding day? How could you betray Mum like this? Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Emily cut him off. No, don't want to hear it. You've done enough. From now on, you're no longer a part of my life. I don't want anything to do with you." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He looked at her, his eyes wide with shock, but she didn't waver. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I had no idea." "It's not your fault," I said, holding her close. "None of this is your fault." As Emily pulled away, Daniel stood up and placed a protective arm around her. "We're with you, Sophia," he said firmly. "Whatever you need, we're here." I nodded, grateful for their support. This wasn't how I wanted the day to go, but in that moment, I felt a sense of relief. The truth was out, and I had stood my ground. Richard and Clara had tried to destroy me, but I had turned the tables on them. The fallout from that night was swift and brutal. For Richard and Clara, at least. By the time the wedding reception ended, the whispers among the guests had turned into full-blown gossip. Everyone knew what Richard had done, and no one was on his side. He had humiliated himself in front of family, friends, and colleagues, and there was no coming back from it. The first blow came the very next morning. Richard's law firm wasted no time addressing the evidence I had provided to the ethics committee. They launched an internal investigation, and within days, Richard was called into a meeting with the senior partners. The verdict was clear. He had violated the firm's code of conduct by using company resources to fund his affair and personal expenses. His actions had not only tarnished his own reputation, but also put the firm's credibility at risk. He was fired on the spot. Losing his job was devastating for Richard. His career had been his identity, the thing he prided himself on the most. Without it, he was just a man with a crumbling marriage, no money, and no future. And speaking of money, the court order freezing our joint accounts meant he couldn't access the funds he had tried to siphon off. Every dollar he thought he could use to start his new life with Clara was now out of his reach. Clara, of course, didn't stick around to support him. The moment she realized Richard was broke and unemployed, she packed her bags and left. She didn't even bother to say goodbye. I heard through the grapevine that she moved back to her hometown, where she's now working as a receptionist at a small real estate office. It turns out her dreams of a glamorous life in the Bahamas were just that, dreams. As for Richard, he tried to salvage what little dignity he had left, but it was a losing battle. His reputation in the legal community was ruined, and no firm would hire him after what he had done. He ended up selling his car and moving into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The man who once prided himself on his success and status was now a shadow of his former self. But the consequences didn't stop there. Emily, true to her word, cut all ties with him. She refused to answer his calls or respond to his messages, and she made it clear that he was no longer welcome in her life. Daniel supported her decision, and together they focused on building their future without him. It broke my heart to see Emily go through that pain, but I was proud of her for standing up for herself and refusing to let Richard's actions define her. As for me, I felt a strange sense of closure. For years, I had put Richard's needs and happiness above my own, sacrificing so much to support his career and our family. But now, I was free. Free from his lies, his betrayal, and his control. I could finally focus on myself and the things that truly mattered. In the weeks following the wedding, life began to settle into a new normal. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments when the weight of everything that had happened felt overwhelming, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I no longer had to walk on eggshells around Richard or worry about what he was hiding. The truth was out, and I had taken back control of my life. Emily and Daniel decided to move to Portland, where Daniel had been offered a great job opportunity. It was bittersweet to see them go, but I knew it was the right decision for them. Emily needed a fresh start, away from the memories of what her father had done. We stayed in close contact, talking on the phone almost every day, and I visited them often. Watching her rebuild her life with Daniel by her side filled me with pride. She was strong, resilient, and determined not to let Richard's betrayal define her. As for me, I decided it was time to focus on my own dreams. For years, I had talked about opening a learning center for underprivileged children, but I had always put it off, telling myself there wasn't enough time or money. Now, with the divorce settlement finalized and Richard out of the picture, I had the resources and freedom to make it happen. I threw myself into the project, pouring my energy into creating a space where kids could learn, grow, and feel supported. It became my passion, my purpose, and it gave me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. Richard tried to reach out a few times, but I ignored him. There was nothing left to say. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. From what I heard, he was struggling to find work and had alienated most of his friends and colleagues. Clara's departure had left him completely alone, and while a part of me felt sorry for him, I knew he had brought it on himself. He had underestimated me, and he had paid the price. One evening, as I sat on the porch of my new home, a cozy little house I had bought with my share of the settlement, I reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the humiliation, it had all been painful, but it had also been a turning point. It forced me to reevaluate my life, to rediscover my strength, and to take back control of my future. I raised a glass of wine to the sunset, a small smile on my lips. "Here's to new beginnings," I whispered to myself. Because that's what this was, a new chapter. One where I was no longer defined by my marriage or my past. I was free, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly happy.